The world has a way of squeezing you until you can't breathe, until you're willing to go anywhere, do anything, just for a gasp of air. For me, that place was at the end of a long, cracked driveway, staring at a set of rusting iron gates twisted into the shape of arthritic fingers. This was Ashworth House, and it felt less like a home and more like a tombstone waiting for a name. The air itself was wrong. It was thick, heavy, pressing in on me with an unnatural silence that swallowed sound whole. I couldn't hear birds, or the wind in the skeletal trees, or even the distant hum of the highway I'd left behind. There was only the frantic thumping of my own heart. A cloying scent hung in the stillness, a sickening mix of decaying roses and freshly turned earth, the smell of a funeral parlor. I gripped the steering wheel of my beat-up sedan, my knuckles white. I could still see the eviction notice taped to our apartment door, the stark red letters a brand of our failure. I could see my mother Clara's face, the brave smile she wore that didn't quite hide the exhaustion in her eyes. And Lily, my little sister, asking if we'd have to leave her school. Their faces were ghosts that had haunted me all the way here, pushing me toward these gates of hell because hell, at least, was offering a paycheck. Taking a breath that did nothing to calm me, I pushed open my car door and walked towards the mansion. The massive oak door opened before my hand even reached the knocker. She stood there, a figure carved from ivory and shadow, Mrs. Eleanora Ashworth. Her hair was a startling bone-white cloud piled high on her head, and her eyes, razor-sharp and black, seemed to pin me in place. Her skin was as pale and thin as paper, a stark contrast to the expensive, jet-black dress she wore. She was ancient, but there was a terrifying vitality in her gaze. "Ethan Hale," she said. Her voice was brittle, like the rustle of dried leaves. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." She stepped back, a silent invitation into the belly of the beast. The moment I crossed the threshold, a profound cold washed over me, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The mansion's interior was a labyrinth of shadows and cold opulence. Towering pieces of furniture loomed under white dust sheets, their shapes like a congregation of shrouded corpses. My worn-out work boots echoed on the black and white marble floor, each sound feeling alien and intrusive, a desecration of the tomb-like silence. She led me to a study where the darkness seemed to cling to the mahogany walls. Without preamble, she named a number that made the air leave my lungs. "The salary is $1,500 a week, cash." $1,500. A week. It was an impossible sum, a miracle. It was the answer to every prayer I'd screamed into my pillow for the last 6 months. It meant rent, food on the table, a new coat for Lily. It meant my mother could stop working double shifts. I heard myself numbly accept before my brain could even process the words. A smile crossed Mrs. Ashworth's face, a thin, bloodless line that didn't come close to touching her eyes. "The compensation," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "reflects the devotion this house demands." She slid a single sheet of typed paper across the polished desk. I picked it up. The text was printed in a deep crimson ink, as if the words themselves had bled onto the page. Before I could read a line, she began to speak, her voice a low, chilling whisper that recited the house's commandments. "The rules are simple, but they are absolute," she began, her eyes fixed on mine. "You must never, under any circumstances, enter the 3 locked rooms on the 2nd floor, for they are not for the living. You will also never let your gaze fall upon the master's portrait in the main hall. He detests being watched." She paused, letting the words hang in the air like frost. "Furthermore, you are not to consume any food or drink that may be left on the dining room table. The house is a generous host, but its hospitality is not for you. After sunset, you must consider the pool area to be non-existent. Do not look at it, and do not approach it." She leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes seeming to pierce right through me as she delivered the final edict. "And lastly, always knock and wait before entering any room, even if you believe it to be empty. You are never truly alone here." I stared at the paper, then back at her, a cold dread coiling in my stomach. This was beyond eccentric. This was insane. But the image of Lily's worried face flashed in my mind, and I pushed the dread down. I could handle weird. For this kind of money, I could handle anything. As if sensing my resolve, Mrs. Ashworth rose. The previous caretaker, a Mr. Silas Graves, found these simple rules too challenging. He lacked the necessary respect for the house. She paused, her eyes glinting. Now he has become a part of it. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. A part of it? What does that mean? She gave me that bloodless smile again. It means this house rewards devotion, Mr. Hale, and it punishes disrespect. I trust you will be a devoted caretaker. With that, she swept from the room. I followed her back to the main entrance in a daze. A moment later, a soundless black sedan slid up the driveway, a phantom in the twilight. She got in without a backward glance, and the car was reclaimed by the shadows, leaving me utterly alone. Or so I thought. The oppressive silence of the house crashed down on me, but it was different now. It was a listening silence. I stood frozen on the marble floor, the list of rules clutched in my hand, and I could feel it, the distinct, prickling sensation of being watched. Not by a person, but by the house itself. From every dark corner, from every shrouded piece of furniture, from the very walls around me, 1,000 unseen eyes were fixed on me. The gilded cage had closed, and I was the songbird trapped inside. To keep my mind from spiraling, I started cleaning the main hall, dusting the shrouded forms of furniture. I was moving a heavy box of what felt like old ledgers when it slipped from my grasp, crashing to the marble floor with a sound that cracked the silence like a gunshot. I flinched, my head snapping up, and my eyes met the portrait. It was an accident, a purely reflexive action, but it was too late. High on the wall above the grand staircase hung the painting of the master. He was a man with severe, aristocratic features and dark, deep-set eyes. But they weren't just paint on canvas. I could swear with a certainty that chilled the marrow in my bones that he was staring directly at me. Not at a point in the room, but at me. A contemptuous smirk twisted his lips, an expression of sickening, private amusement, as if he'd just witnessed a pathetic little bug blunder into his web. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I wrenched my gaze away, stumbling back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look up again. Later, I did a final walkthrough, checking the locks on the doors and windows. My last stop was the long wall of glass that overlooked the back terrace. The pool was lit from within, casting an eerie sapphire glow into the night. I was about to turn away, remembering the rule, consider the pool area to be non-existent, when a flicker of movement caught my eye. Down in the depths of the illuminated water, a shape was moving. It was humanoid, with a head, a torso, and 2 long limbs, but it was made of absolute blackness. It wasn't a shadow cast by something. It was a 3-dimensional void, a human-shaped hole in reality that didn't reflect the pool's light but seemed to devour it. It moved with a slow, deliberate purpose along the bottom, not swimming with the awkward motions of a person, but gliding, as smooth and silent as spilled ink. My blood ran cold. I watched, mesmerized and horrified, as it completed its patrol from one end of the pool to the other before sinking into the darkness of the deep end and disappearing. Sleep, I knew, was a luxury I wouldn't be afforded. I lay in the stiff, cold bed of my designated room, every nerve alight. The house was a living, breathing thing around me, and I was a foreign body it was trying to reject. Sometime deep in the night, when the darkness was at its thickest, I heard it. A sound from the hall. Slap, slap, slap. It wasn't the sound of shoes on the stone floor. It was the soft, distinct sound of wet, bare feet. My body went rigid. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps grew closer, slow and measured, leaving a faint, dripping echo in their wake. They stopped directly outside my door. The silence that followed, was worse than the sound itself. I imagined a hand reaching for the knob, a wet eye pressed to the keyhole. An eternity seemed to pass as I lay there, paralyzed by a fear so profound it felt like a physical weight on my chest. Then, after what felt like a lifetime, the footsteps resumed, slap, slap, slap. Fainter now, as they continued down the hall, heading directly toward the wing with the 3 forbidden locked rooms. Sunlight, I discovered, was no disinfectant for the creeping dread that had taken root in my soul. It streamed in through the tall, grimy windows, but it was a thin, watery light that seemed to do nothing to warm the mansion's bones or chase away the deepest shadows. The fear from the night before clung to me like a shroud. The staring portrait, the gliding void in the pool, the sound of those wet, slapping feet in the hall. They weren't memories. They felt like promises. I spent the morning avoiding the main hall entirely, focusing my work on the upper floors. I told myself it was about being efficient, but I knew I was just terrified of accidentally glancing at that painting again. I was dusting the long, empty upstairs corridor when I saw it. One of the 3 forbidden doors, the one at the very end of the hall, was no longer sealed shut. It was ajar, open just a crack, a sliver of profound darkness in the dusty light. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to walk away and pretend I hadn't seen it. Mrs. Ashworth's voice was a razor in my memory. They are not for the living. But the memory of the footsteps, the slow, dripping sound of them heading right for this spot, was stronger. I had to know. My heart pounding a heavy, muffled drum against my ribs, I crept forward and pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. The room smelled of stale air and dust so thick it felt like fur in the back of my throat. It had been a child's room once. Small, delicate furniture, a rocking horse, a tiny writing desk, a wardrobe, all lay dormant under white sheets, like a miniature version of the morgue downstairs. The room was a perfect, undisturbed time capsule, frozen for decades. Except for the bed. The bed was different. Amidst the thick layers of settled dust that covered everything else, the covers on the small bed were rumpled, thrown back as if its occupant had just left. An indentation, head-sized and fresh, was pressed into the center of the single pillow, and on that indentation was a dark, damp patch on the yellowed pillowcase. It wasn't a stain from age, it was recent. It looked exactly as if someone with a soaked head had been lying there, weeping all through the night. The thought sent a violent shiver through me. I backed away slowly, pulling the door closed until I heard the soft, final click of the latch. A click that sounded like a final judgment. I had to get out of the house. I fled downstairs and out into the overgrown gardens, needing the feel of open sky above me. I started trimming the wild hedges that bordered the terrace. The repetitive work a small comfort, but my eyes kept being drawn, against my will, to the placid blue surface of the pool. The rule was for after sunset, I rationalized. It was daytime, it was safe. It wasn't. It was there again, gliding in the deep end. In the clear light of day, it was even more horrifying. It wasn't a trick of the light or a shadow from the clouds. It was a deeper, more absolute black than any natural shadow I had ever seen, a tear in the fabric of the water itself. This time, I couldn't just stand there. I had to know what it was. I spotted a long-handled skimmer net leaning against the pool house. My hands trembling, I picked it up and approached the edge of the water, extending the pole out over the gliding shape. Was it an oil deposit? A strange chemical reaction? I had to know. I lowered the net. The instant the fine mesh touched the surface of the water directly above the shape, the thing convulsed. It didn't swim away. It contracted violently, folding in on itself with an impossible speed before dissolving completely, spreading through the water like a drop of black ink, and then vanishing altogether. The water was left pristine, sparkling, and utterly undisturbed. There was nothing. Shaking, I stumbled back from the pool's edge and headed for the safety of the back door. That's when I saw them. Leading from the stone coping of the pool to the door I was about to open was a line of perfect, bare footprints, the same ones I had heard last night. I knelt, my terror mixed with a desperate need for a logical answer. But there was no water. They weren't wet at all. They were dry to the touch, yet they shimmered on the stone with a greasy, iridescent sheen, like an oil slick on pavement. As I held my hand just above one of the prints, a chill radiated from it. It was a tangible, bone-deep cold that seeped into my joints, making my fingers ache. These weren't the traces of a ghost. This was the trail of something that had crawled out of the cold, dark water and walked, dripping, right into the house, right up to my door. Fear has a texture. At first, it's a fine powder, a dusting of unease you can almost brush off. But soon it becomes a thick, clinging grime, and then a suffocating ooze that gets into your lungs and makes it hard to breathe. By my third day at Ashworth House, I was drowning in it. The line between what was real and what was impossible had been completely erased, and I was adrift in a waking nightmare. I was trying to ground myself in the mundane, in the simple physical work I was hired to do. A light bulb had flickered out at the top of the grand staircase, casting the landing in a deeper, more treacherous gloom. I hauled the heavy wooden stepladder from a utility closet, the sound of its legs scraping on the marble floor a small, reassuringly normal noise. As I climbed, my focus was on not losing my balance, on the simple task of unscrewing the old bulb. When the new bulb was in place, I flicked the switch. Light flooded the landing and I took a step down, feeling a sliver of satisfaction. And then I made the mistake of glancing across the hall. The portrait of the master was now perfectly illuminated. The change was instant and sickening. The faint, contemptuous smirk I had seen before was gone. In its place was a full-blown leer, a silent, predatory glee that stretched the painted lips over yellowed teeth. His dark eyes seemed to burn with a fresh, active malice. But that wasn't what made me nearly fall from the ladder. It was his hand. Before, his left hand had been resting on his lap, fingers curled loosely. Now it was raised. A long, skeletal finger, its nail yellow and overgrown, was extended, pointing directly up the main staircase. It wasn't just a change, it was a gesture, a silent, undeniable command, directing me toward the corridor with the 3 forbidden rooms. The house wasn't just haunted, it was intelligent, and it was telling me where to go. My heart hammering, I scrambled down the ladder and fled outside again, gasping for air that didn't feel heavy with age and malice. As I stood on the front steps, my hands on my knees, a sound cut through the unnatural quiet. The distinct crunch of footsteps on the gravel driveway. Hope flared in my chest like a struck match. Mrs. Ashworth. It had to be. Even her chilling presence was better than this profound, supernatural isolation. At least she was a person. I sprinted around the side of the house, my boots skidding on the overgrown path, expecting to see her black sedan. The driveway was empty. There was no car, no person, nothing but the cracked, weed-choked gravel stretching out to the road. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before. I was about to turn away, my brief hope curdling into deeper despair, when I saw them. Footprints. A single line of them, clearly impressed into the loose gravel. They led from the edge of the main road and proceeded about halfway up the drive. And then they just stopped. They didn't turn. There were no corresponding tracks leading away. They just ended, abruptly in the middle of the driveway, as if their owner had been plucked from the earth or had simply evaporated into the thin afternoon air. That night, sleep was not an option. I sat in a chair facing the door of my room, a heavy fireplace poker resting on my lap, my eyes burning from exhaustion. I found myself drawn again and again to the window overlooking the pool, a moth to a terrifying flame. I knew I shouldn't look, but not looking felt worse. And then I saw it. It was no longer a void in the water, it was standing on the stone deck beside the pool. It was a tall, dark, humanoid figure, standing perfectly motionless. Its limbs were unnaturally long and thin, jointed at odd angles, like a scarecrow assembled from sticks of solidified night. It wasn't wearing black. It was black, a silhouette that was somehow darker than the surrounding darkness. My fear gave way to a surge of adrenaline. I wasn't going to just watch this time. I lunged for the wall and slammed my hand down on the bank of switches for the exterior lights. A bank of powerful floodlights ignited, bathing the entire terrace and pool in a harsh, brilliant white. For a split second, the figure was caught in the glare. And then it did something that shattered the last of my sanity. It didn't vanish, it didn't run, it folded. With a fluid, horrifying motion that defied all laws of physics, its long limbs retracted, its torso collapsed, and the entire three-dimensional form was sucked impossibly into its own shadow on the stone deck. For a heartbeat, the shadow itself seemed to writhe, and then it was just a shadow again, flat and inert, cast by the corner of the pool house. The monster had folded itself into nothing, and I knew, with a certainty that left me trembling in the silent, empty house, that it could unfold again anywhere it pleased. The house was no longer just watching me. It was beginning to communicate. Its language was one of rot and ruin, of silence and creeping things. And I, its sole terrified student, was learning to read the signs. They were not warnings to flee. They felt more like offerings, or worse, invitations. The first gifts appeared in the kitchen. I walked in to make a cup of instant coffee, my hands shaking from a cocktail of exhaustion and pure adrenaline, and saw it sitting on the otherwise spotless countertop. It was a mouse, but it wasn't mangled or bloody. It was a perfect, mummified husk, completely drained of color until its fur was a uniform, ashen gray. Its tiny body was stiff, its limbs locked in place, and its mouth was stretched wide in a silent, needle-toothed scream. There was no scent of decay, only the faint, dry smell of dust. It was placed deliberately, a tiny, horrifying sculpture left for me to find. Later that day I found another one, placed precisely on the newel post at the bottom of the main staircase, its screaming mouth aimed toward the master's leering portrait. A third one greeted me that evening, left directly on the threshold of my bedroom door, a clear and personal message. They were offerings left for a guest, or perhaps sacrifices left for a god. I couldn't decide which possibility was more terrifying. I disposed of them with a shovel, feeling their impossible lightness, their brittle fragility, as if they were made of nothing but dried paper and stored-up panic. The house communicated with sound, too, or rather, the lack of it. A tall linen closet at the end of the upstairs hall had developed a habit. I would walk past and see it was firmly shut. I'd go downstairs for an hour, and upon my return I would find the door standing wide open, revealing neat stacks of yellowed sheets within. It never creaked. I never heard the latch turn. It simply opened when I wasn't looking, a silent, patient trickster in the hall. At first I just closed it every time I passed. But its position, just a few yards from the forbidden child's room, began to feel significant. The house was trying to draw my attention to this wing. One night, fueled by a desperate need for answers, I found myself standing before the locked child's door again. The closet door across the hall was open, a silent invitation. I ignored it and pressed my ear against the cold, smooth wood of the forbidden door. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I heard it, a sound so faint I thought I was imagining it. It was the sound of a child sobbing. A thin, broken, ethereal weeping that seemed to come from a great distance, full of a sorrow so profound it made the hairs on my arms stand on end. It was the sound I had imagined coming from the damp pillow. Then a second sound started, and my blood froze. It was a deep, guttural noise, a low, wet rumble from a throat that was not human. It was trying to be soothing, but the sound it made was a series of horrifying, clicking sounds, like a giant insect chittering or wet stones being knocked together in a cave deep underground. It was the sound of a predator mimicking comfort. The inhuman clicks punctuated the child's sobs, a monstrous lullaby being sung to a captive soul. I snatched my head back from the door as if the wood had burned me, stumbling backward into the hall, my hand clamped over my mouth to stifle a scream. After that, everything shifted. The very atmosphere of the mansion grew thick and charged, like the air before a lightning strike. The silence was no longer empty. It was full of listening. The feeling of being watched from a dark corner had evolved into a crushing, claustrophobic certainty that I was constantly surrounded. I was no longer a lonely caretaker in a spooky house. I was caged, sharing my enclosure with unseen things that were pressing closer every second. The air itself felt populated. I'd turn a corner and feel the cold wake of something that had just moved past. I'd feel a pressure change in a room, the same way you can feel when someone quietly enters. The house was awake now. Its inhabitants were stirring, and I was beginning to understand that I wasn't here to care for the house. I was here to be its next meal. The inhuman clicking and the child's sobs were the final crack in my composure. I couldn't stay another minute inside that suffocating tomb. I burst out into the overgrown gardens, the daylight a welcome but weak comfort. My plan was simple. Grab the few things I owned from my room, get in my car, and drive until Ashworth House was nothing but a bad memory. Let Mrs. Ashworth keep her blood money. My sanity, my life, was worth more. I was hacking away at a thorny, overgrown rose bush near the edge of the woods, my movements frantic and clumsy, when I felt a sudden shift in the air. A cold spot. I froze, my garden shears held tight in my hand. "You shouldn't be here," a voice whispered. It was thin and raspy, like the sound of dry leaves skittering across pavement. I spun around. A man was standing there, not 10 feet away. He hadn't been there a second ago. He was thin and stooped, wearing the faded, dirt-stained remnants of a gardener's uniform. His skin was the color of gray dishwater, translucent and pale, and his hair was thin and wispy. But it was his eyes that seized me. They were wide, stretched open in a state of permanent, abject panic, as if he were eternally witnessing some unspeakable horror. "Who are you?" I asked, my own voice trembling. "I'm the one who came before you," he rasped, his terrified eyes locked on the house behind me. "Silas Graves." The name hit me like a physical blow. Mrs. Ashworth's words echoed in my head. He lacked respect, now he has become a part of it. He was supposed to be gone, a cautionary tale, but here he was, a soul-drained specter in the dying garden. "What is this place?" I demanded, taking a step toward him. "What is happening here?" A shudder racked his frail body. "You have to leave, now, before it chooses you." "Chooses me for what?" I pressed, my voice cracking. "I hear things, I see things. The portrait, it watches me." "It's not a painting," Silas whispered, his gaze darting around nervously. "It's an eye, its eye. It watches, it judges, and it chooses." "Whose eye? What is it?" He flinched at the question, as if the name itself was painful to speak. "We called it the Collector. It collects things, memories, hope, joy, souls. And when there's nothing left to take from your spirit, it takes the rest." My mind raced, connecting the terrifying, disparate pieces. "The food," I breathed. "The feast on the table." A flicker of something, maybe relief, crossed his face. "You didn't eat it? Good. It's an offering. To eat it is to give permission. To willingly become a host, to let it inside you." "And Mrs. Ashworth?" I asked, the image of her cold, paper-pale face flashing in my mind. "Is she a part of this?" Silas let out a dry, mirthless puff of air. "She is its shepherd. She finds new flocks when the old ones have been consumed. She leads the lambs to the slaughter again and again." The full, monstrous weight of the truth was beginning to settle on me, a crushing pressure in my chest. I thought of the countless caretakers this house must have had over the decades. "What happened to the others?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The ones before me? Where are they?" For the first time, Silas looked directly at me, and the sheer, undiluted terror in his eyes was the most frightening thing I had ever seen. He trembled violently, and a single, skeletal hand rose and pointed a shaky finger toward the back of the house, toward the pool. "The house, it doesn't just kill you, he choked out, his voice breaking. "It digests you, slowly." His gaze flickered to the placid blue water. "What's in the water? The black shape that glides in the deep, that's what's left of us, all of us. We're the meal, and the house is always hungry." The moment the words left his lips, a change began. His purpose fulfilled, his warning delivered, the house began to reclaim him. The edges of his form started to fray, dissolving like smoke. The faded color of his clothes and the pale gray of his skin leached away, turning to fine, airborne dust. He didn't scream or fight it. He simply watched me, his eyes wide with that same eternal panic. He disintegrated before my very eyes, flaking away at the edges like a page of ancient, brittle paper turning to ash. In seconds, he was gone, leaving nothing behind but a faint swirl of dust that settled on the dead petals of the roses at my feet. I didn't think, I ran. Silas's final, dust-choked words had given form and function to the house's horrors, and the truth was 1,000 times worse than anything I could have imagined. My mind was a white-hot scream of pure panic. Digests you. That's what's left of us. The garden became a blur of green and gray as I sprinted, my lungs burning, my only instinct to put as much distance as possible between myself and that placid blue water. But like a moth drawn to a flame that has already burned its wings, I couldn't stop myself from looking. As I rounded the corner of the terrace, I threw one last horrified glance at the pool. The water was churning. The placid surface was broken as something dark and thick began to rise from the deep end. It wasn't a swimmer climbing out. It was a torrent of absolute blackness pouring upwards against gravity, an eruption of liquid night. It oozed over the stone coping, congealing on the deck, pulling itself together. The inky substance solidified, rising into a tall, gaunt, skeletal figure whose limbs were too long, whose joints bent at impossible angles. Its head was a smooth, featureless ovoid. The collector had emerged from its watery larder, and it stood dripping on the stone, its blank face turning slowly in my direction. I screamed, a raw, ragged sound torn from my throat, and sprinted for the front door. My hand, slick with sweat, fumbled with the heavy brass knob. I twisted it, threw my shoulder against the oak, but it didn't budge. I tried again, rattling it with all my strength. It was sealed tight, as if the door and its frame had fused into one solid piece of wood. I lurched to the tall windows flanking the entrance, beating my fists against the thick, unyielding glass. Locked, sealed, trapped. A deathly cold began to radiate from the walls around me. It was no longer a passive chill, but an active, aggressive force, sinking into my skin and making my teeth chatter violently. I watched in disbelief as frost, delicate and sharp as needles, began to bloom on the interior of the window panes, spreading in intricate fern-like patterns. The house was turning itself into a crypt, and I was being buried alive within it. Panic gave way to a feral desperation. I abandoned the front of the house and ran, my footsteps echoing in the suddenly arctic hall toward the kitchen. It was my only other chance. Inside, I heard it. A sound from the top of the main staircase. A wet, tearing, dragging sound, followed by a soft, heavy thump. It was the sound of something immense and saturated pulling itself along the floorboards. The collector was hunting me. There was no time. I grabbed a heavy wooden stool from the kitchen island, hoisted it high, and threw it with every ounce of strength I had at the window over the sink. The glass didn't just break. It exploded outwards in a deafening roar, a shocking violation of the house's crushing silence. I didn't hesitate. I scrambled onto the counter, heedless of the jagged shards still lining the frame. Pain flared hot and sharp as the glass sliced into my forearms and hands, but I barely felt it. I pushed myself through the opening, tumbling onto the damp grass outside, the warm sting of my own blood, a shocking contrast to the tomb-like cold I'd left behind. My keys. I needed my keys. They were on a hook by the back door, where I'd left them after my first day. I scrambled to my feet and ran, my arms dripping crimson onto the flagstones. I snatched the keys, my bloodied fingers struggling to get a grip, and sprinted for the driveway. My car started on the first try, its engine a glorious, life-affirming roar. I slammed it into reverse, spun the wheel, and floored it, spraying gravel as the tires bit down. I didn't slow. I didn't look back until I was rocketing down the long, cracked driveway toward the rusted gates and freedom. Just as I passed the threshold, my eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. My heart stopped. It was standing there, framed perfectly in the grand front doorway of Ashworth House. The collector. The tall, skeletal silhouette of pure darkness stood motionless, its featureless face turned directly toward my fleeing car. Then it did something that would be burned into my memory forever. It slowly raised one of its long, thin, bony hands, and with a calm, unhurried, and deliberate motion, it gave me a slow wave goodbye. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and raw, ragged breaths. Every shadow the car cast seemed to writhe and stretch, and every reflection in the window held the ghost of a tall, dark figure. But when I finally saw the familiar, graffiti-scarred brick of my apartment building, a wave of relief so powerful it was nauseating washed over me. This was my fortress. This was safety. This was home. I stumbled up the 3 flights of stairs, my bloodied arms wrapped in my torn jacket, and pushed open our apartment door. The warmth of our small home hit me first, the familiar smell of my mom's cooking, the sound of the television playing a cartoon for Lily. It was the sound of life, of normalcy. It was everything I had been fighting for. "Ethan!" My mother, Clara, rushed to me, her face etched with worry. "My God, what happened to your arms? Are you okay?" Lily peeked out from behind her, her big eyes wide with concern. "It's nothing, Mom, just an accident with a window." "I'm fine," I lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. How could I ever tell them the truth? Clara, seeming to accept my flimsy explanation for now, suddenly broke into a brilliant smile. Her relief was palpable. "Well, you must have made a wonderful impression. An elegant lady in a fancy black car dropped this off for you. She said to thank you for all your hard work." She turned and gestured to the small kitchen table, and my heart stopped. Sitting there, on one of our mismatched plates, was a chocolate cake. It was a perfect, decadent thing, with a dark, glossy frosting that seemed to drink the light of our small kitchen. It was the twin of the dessert I had seen in the dining room of Ashworth House. The warmth in the room vanished. The smell of my mother's stew was suddenly overwhelmed by another scent rising from the cake. Beneath the sweet aroma of chocolate was a faint, cloying undertone, the scent of old, spilled blood and damp rot. It was the smell of the house. "I'll cut us all a piece," Clara said cheerfully, reaching for a knife. "We can celebrate your new job." She was about to make the first slice. Lily was looking at the cake with hungry eyes. The image of the phantom feast, the warning from Silas, "To eat it is to give permission," flashed in my mind. I didn't shout, I didn't warn, I lunged. My hand shot out and I smashed the plate against the floor. It shattered, and the cake exploded, the dark frosting splattering across the linoleum like a spray of black tar. My mother screamed, jumping back. Lily started to cry. They weren't looking at the wreckage on the floor. They were staring at me, their faces masks of terror. In my desperation to save them, I had become the monster in the room. "Ethan, what is wrong with you?" Clara cried, shielding Lily with her body. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. What could I say? That the cake was a curse? That our family had been targeted by a soul-eating entity from a haunted mansion? They would think I'd lost my mind. I just shook my head, my whole body trembling, and spent the rest of the night cleaning the floor. But no matter how hard I scrubbed, a dark, greasy stain remained on the linoleum, a permanent shadow that could not be fully cleaned. The next day, my terror was confirmed. When I opened our apartment door to leave, an identical cake was sitting on the doormat. No one had delivered it. There was no elegant lady, no black car. It had simply appeared. A small, folded note was tucked into the frosting. My hands shook as I opened it. In precise crimson script, it read, "Your service is greatly appreciated." The day after that, another cake. Another note, this one more sinister. "The house misses its caretaker." The third note was the one that broke me. It wasn't outside the door. I found it that evening, lying on my little sister's pillow, right where her head would be. We know where Lily sleeps. I finally understood. I hadn't escaped. I had only widened the hunting ground. I hadn't saved my family. I had led the monster directly to our door. That night, unable to breathe, I stood at our living room window, looking down at the quiet street below. The city lights cast long shadows from the trees and lampposts. As I watched, a tall, thin, black figure detached itself from the shadow of a lamppost across the street. It didn't walk. It glided, a piece of the night come to life, and slipped silently into the darkness of the alley right beside our building. The hunt wasn't over. It had just followed me home. And now, my entire family was the prey.